Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. My name is Daniel Perkins. Welcome to the CIS Top 18 Critical Security Controls. We're going to go through part 2 today, protecting our people. So for today, we're going to review the CIS standard, the top 18, and just kind of a quick overview that some of the stuff we covered in part 1, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Today's topic is going to be around people, right? So we're going to talk around account management, how we manage accounts according to the CIS Top 18. We're going to look at access control, how we provision those accounts. We're going to take a look at security awareness and skills training, definitely a high priority. And then we're going to take a look at the people we work with, right? Those service providers, those suppliers. The goal here today, what I hope that you get out of this is really just one thing you can use in your environment. While I'd love for every slide to give you something useful, that may be very high expectations, but I hope you get one or two things that you can use to improve your security and get a better understanding of the CIS Top 18. Some of what you're going to hear today may be new to you. Some of it you may have heard before, and that's okay. Just take what works for you and discard the rest. And again, when we're talking about CIS, a lot of this is recommendations only. There's no mandate or require it to follow as the controls specify. So let's get into it. Quick review. So CIS, that's the Center for Internet Security. We're looking at the top 18 critical controls today. And those were last updated in 2021 to version 18. That update, we went from the top 20 to the top 18. And with that, those 18 control categories, they cover a number of areas and the ones we're going to talk about today are those people controls that we just saw. The good thing about the CIS Top 18 is it is community driven, right? So this is developed, modified, improved, enhanced by folks like us, right? Who are doing security and doing IT. And it's used across multiple industries, right? So whether you're in legal, whether you're in manufacturing, retail, there's going to be controls that apply for you. And it's a very holistic, comprehensive approach, not necessarily specified to one industry or another. Now, some of the strengths and weaknesses for CIS that we reviewed in part 1, right? It is a technical focused control. We're focused on those elements within IT that we need to set up to improve our security. These are activity-based controls. As we go through it, right, you're going to see that, hey, the folks who are doing account management, here's the things they need to worry about. The folks who are working with vendors that we're going to look at today, here's the stuff they need to worry about. But it takes a lot of the controls and makes it that activity focus. So your network engineers who are doing network security, they can focus on those things. They don't have to worry about what people and vendor management controls specify. Another benefit or strength to CIS Top 18, which we don't see in some of the other standards, is they're very prescriptive controls. And we're going to see that today evidence with passwords, right? It's going to give us very clear guidelines, recommendations according to CIS what we need to do. There's implementation groups, and we'll take a look at those in a moment. As you start your security journey with CIS, you start with that group 1 and move up to group 3 as you progress. This is also attestation only. There's no certification that I can provide to you or the CIS provides to say, hey, we do security well and we do it according to CIS. This is going to be attestation only. Now, what it does lack is that organization, right? Because it is technical focus, we see a lack of organizational policy, right? Defining how our company, the why we're doing these things, right? It does also lack risk assessment, right? So it's lacking that comprehensive or holistic view of our organization, the risk we face, and designing the controls around those risks. It does lack some flexibility as well, right? Because we've got very prescriptive controls. Now we can choose to take those and modifies, but if we're going to stick to the core of what CIS provides, it does lack that flexibility. And it also lacks some coverage in areas, right? We talked about risk management. It doesn't have any controls around risk management, but it does have controls. Also, it's missing controls, around privacy and compliance, right? And those controls are not present that we see in some of the other standards. Now, it does align nicely to other standards like NIST, CSF, ISO 27001, SOC 2, and others, right? You can go to the CIS website and there's mappings there that you can download to map it to almost any control standard out there. And a lot of the NIST CSF controls are already tagged. Now this is version 1.1 tagging. It's not, I haven't seen an update for 2.0 yet, but it's got those 5 domain areas that are tagged in a lot of the CIS controls. Now, when we think about implementation group 1, right, I said that's where we would start our journey with CIS. So that's going to be primarily driven towards small enterprises, right? Those small organizations that, maybe they've got limited IT, they're focused on defending against general attacks, and they're really using commercial software, like commercial off-the-shelf software. They don't have a lot of enterprise-grade applications. They also primarily have a low sensitivity of data when we're thinking about implementation group 1. And the focus here is around availability when we think about the confidentiality, integrity, and availability triad around data security. Here we're focused on keeping things available and online, keeping our business moving in group 1. And you're going to see that as we look at the groups today for the various controls. Now, group 2, we start getting into medium enterprise, right? So most likely these have got a dedicated IT at this point, maybe a small security or outsourced security. Maybe you're working with somebody like Secure IP 360 to manage that. Operational complexity is increasing. We may have some enterprise software in our environment, but we're still using a lot of commercial off-the-shelf products. The focus here is really moving towards getting that regulatory and compliance satisfaction, meeting all those controls, because we're worried about loss of confidence from our customers and clients, making sure that they feel that they can entrust us with their data, that they can trust that we're going to take care of all the information they provide to us and use it appropriately. So here we're focusing now on the confidentiality of the data security triad, right? So we've already got availability covered in group 1. As we're moving into group 2, we're focused on managing the confidentiality of our data. Now with group 3, generally these controls are going to be for large enterprise, right? So at this point, you probably have a large IT, maybe even a dedicated security team. And the focus here is starting to defend against targeted attacks. Now, certainly in a large enterprise, you're going to have enterprise class software, right? You're probably still going to have commercial off-the-shelf software. You pretty much never get rid of that, but you're going to start having more complex systems that are maybe integrated to other complex systems. So we see that enterprise class software. Again, we're focused here on regulatory and compliance, and there's probably even a bit of public welfare involved here, right? So maybe you're a critical supplier for an industry, maybe you're even critical infrastructure yourself. And these controls are going to help you defend against those targeted attacks and maintain that public trust and confidence. So here we're focused on the integrity of our data, right? Making sure we know who's editing what, when it's getting edited, what's getting changed. We get that full comprehensive approach that as our data is edited or modified or changed, we've got good confidence it's being done so in a trustworthy fashion. All right. So with that in mind, quick review of the CIS Top 18. Let's get into our first control today. So we're going to talk about accounts. So control 5 here, we're really focused on account management. And what type of accounts are we focused on? Well, we're focused on end user accounts. That's pretty straightforward, right? We've got multiple users in our environment. We need to also consider service accounts, right? We've got machine accounts or service accounts that are facilitating applications in our environment. Maybe they're moving data around for us. And of course, last but not least, is those privileged accounts, right? Those domain admins, those application admin who can do elevated actions in our environment. Maybe they can do things that other users cannot do. But we also can't forget a few others. Those are vendor accounts, right? Nearly every organization we talk to, in fact, every organization has got vendors working in their environment at some level or another. We may also have guest accounts in our environment. That's something we cannot ignore. And of course, network and system accounts, right? When we're thinking about AD, there are machine accounts out there. Maybe we've also got network accounts that we're using to maintain operations in our environment. Those have got to be captured as part of our account management process. All right, so let's take a look at what we need to do for group 1. Now, this is going to feel a little familiar, maybe a little redundant from the first ones we looked at, but what do we need to do first? Establish an inventory, right? This needs to cover all of those account types that we just talked about, right? Every account that we're going to create in our environment, we need to understand what it's doing. We also need to identify that account to a person, right? The goal here is to attribute every action, every login back to a person. We want to avoid any shared accounts. We also need to be updating this inventory on a quarterly basis, at least. Maybe more often, maybe less, but at least quarterly, we need to be doing an update to our inventory. This is something that we also see that some clients miss is those vendor accounts, right? Sometimes we'll see shared vendor accounts, like there's a vendor 1 and a vendor 2. I encourage you to get away from that. We want to attribute a user's action back to a person. And one of the best ways we can do that with vendors is to make sure they're using unique accounts in our environment. Yes, it can be a little bit of administrative or management overhead, but I can now attribute the actions of my vendor back to a person. If I need to hold that person accountable, I've got a very good audit trail to show what happened and who did the action in my environment. But also, just understanding when my vendors are in my environment, who that person is, that's critical to getting that identification attribution back to a person. So here, we want to know who we have in our environment, right? That's the takeaway here. And we want to know who should not be there, right? So that's the goal of this inventory, is to know who we have and who should not be there, right? And we're going to see what I mean by that and the who should not be there in a moment. Now, the other part of this group 1 is we want to use unique passwords, right? So we want to avoid common or shared passwords. And that gets back to that shared accounts as well. CIS Top 18 does give us some very specifics here on password length. Now, of course, we want to enable complexity and history, all those other controls that we see that we establish as part of an AD password policy. But here we see guidance from CIS Top 18 that 8 characters with MFA is sufficient. That's going to meet the standard, and 14 characters without MFA. Now, that's what the standard says. Certainly, you would be encouraged and well advised to use a longer than that password, right? Especially if you're using a password manager for those privileged accounts. Make those as long as you can reasonably do or technically do based on where you're using those accounts. Our penetration testing team, our offset team, they will always guide and say longer passwords are better. It takes them more time to crack those passwords. Even with MFA, the barrier that we can create by adding longer password slows the attackers down, gives us more visibility to how they're trying to compromise our passwords. Anyways, point being, longer passwords are better, but CIS Top 18 does give us some specifics here. Let's continue down group 1. So part of that knowing who should not be there is we want to disable dormant accounts, right? We got 45 days of inactivity as prescribed here. We should be capturing these disabled or dormant accounts, rather, as part of our inventory review, right? That should be where we're identifying these accounts in that quarterly review. Now, this is a 45 days of inactivity. We want to disable that account. So we probably want to automate this where possible. Now, that could be a straight automation that we've got in AD. Hey, after 45 days, we disable that account. If you're not that clever or that's beyond your ability, just maybe consider generating a report out of AD that gives you that list. And then you can hand that over to an admin and say, hey, here's my list of 10, 15 accounts, whatever it is. Go through AD and start disabling these. Obviously, we can automate that if we want to, but at minimum, automate the reporting for yourself so you understand what actions you need to take. Now, another control in group 1 is we want to restrict privileges. This is something we see that is a fantastic defense against elevating privileges in an environment once an attacker gets a foothold. Too many times we see an environment where the admins, the domain admins, they have the keys to the kingdom, right? And as they're using their accounts, they're using it for general computing. And we know that occasionally, and it often happens, that's where an attacker can gain a foothold. They send a malicious email, they stand up a malicious site. If we've separated that admin privileges from our general computing account, it's a barrier for the attacker to elevate their privileges. And again, we want to follow the same controls that we saw in the first part, where we've got a unique username and unique password for that account. So traditionally, we would say a general computing account, hey, that's Daniel.Perkins, right? For an administrator, we're thinking about Daniel-admin or admin-Daniel. Whatever flavor you want to use is fine, but we want to separate those domain accounts from our general computing accounts, especially for those domain admins. And it creates that audit trail of who did what where, because now we've got a separate account doing those administrative actions. All right, so let's move into group 2. So here we want to start thinking about inventory of service accounts, right? One of the big things that we see clients missing is understanding what the secure service account is doing, right? Often, or we'll do a review of accounts and we'll have a list of service accounts. Hey, what does this account do? Oh, I don't know. What does this service account do? Ooh, I haven't seen that one in several years. That was for this legacy system that we offboarded 3 years ago. Okay, so as you're doing an inventory of service accounts, start dropping in that who's owning and what is the purpose of that service account, right? And again, here we want quarterly updates. We want to set those review dates that, hey, let's validate and verify that we need this service account in another 3 months time or 6 months time. Let's validate that and review it quarterly to make sure we don't have too many service accounts. Another element we need to consider with service accounts is any cloud integrations, right? A lot of us are integrating from on-premise or cloud to cloud. We want to make sure we capture what those service accounts are doing, how they're used. So as you're doing your service account inventory, confirm you've got all those cloud service accounts out there. That may be native or local to that cloud app. It may be within your AD, but we want to make sure we've captured what the business purpose is for those and are they still required after some time. Now, another one here, which we probably all kind of hit the box here because most of us are using Active Directory, but this is the last control here for Group 2 and account management. We want to centralize our account management. So here we're thinking about Active Directory, Entra ID, or Azure AD, right? Most of us are already checking the box. It's kind of a default at this point. But if you're not in the Microsoft land, consider using LDAP, right? Some sort of centralized directory to manage all your accounts. If you've got one source of truth for your environment, maybe that's even something like a cloud access security broker. We'll talk about that in the next one in access controls management, but something to help centralize, reduce the overhead to your team for managing multiple account management platforms. You know, anytime that we can centralize our account management, it's going to make it easier to manage, less overhead for our IT teams. Now, for Control 5, this is all there is. There is no Group 2 or Group 3 rather. So effectively, by the time you're a large enterprise, you should be hitting all the Group 1 or Group 2 controls as well. That will be the goal here following CIS Top 18. All right, so let's take a look at Control 6, Access Controls Management. So a little different from accounts here. Now we're talking about the authorization within our application. So now we need to think about how we're provisioning access to our data and application. So using the CIS language here, we're talking about access to enterprise assets. So that's kind of our data or information that we've got. Of course, we need to consider access to applications. Another area that we need to consider access for is going to be remote access as well. Now here too, we also need to consider role-based access. We're going to talk about that, but that should be the guiding principle for you thinking about access control management is we really want to drive towards getting that role-based access. And we'll talk about what that means. So in Group 1, what do we have? Well, first we need to establish an access granting process, right? Some way to, as we have new hires coming in, as we have role changes, as we have access requests, we want to establish a consistent process for granting access, making sure we know who's coming in and getting access to what. Now, where we can, we might need to automate this, right? If you're in an environment that's got hundreds of users, maybe thousands of users, if you can automate the process for maybe kind of those foundational security groups or foundational groups, distribution groups, they need to be a part of, absolutely consider automating that. But if you're not quite that large, consider just a consistent documentation for new hires and terminations, right? Some sort of checklist or maybe a ticket from HR to the IT team. Hey, Daniel's starting on this date. He's in this department. He needs these roles. You know, it can be a bit technical at times to develop those checklists, but as we're thinking about role-based access, if you can simplify it to a degree for HR, just get the role to department, and then you as IT can decide which security groups they need to be. That will facilitate a good approach to onboarding, making sure you get that consistent communication. Now, the other side of this, right, is as people leave the company, leave the organization, we need to revoke their access. Now, the approach here that we want to follow is a disable first, right? In some of the organizations we talk to, they automatically just delete the account and everything's gone. By disabling first, if we need to get any data out of that account, it's still available for us. The second part after we disable the accounts is we want to start revoking those rights, right? Kind of stripping back all of the permissions they had. So it's basically a generic account that has no access to really anything, right? So if that account does get reactivated, it basically has limited privileges, can't do much, right? The other thing we have to consider here is we need to preserve as needed. There are cases, certainly for all of us, where we've got an involuntary termination, and we need to keep records of what that user did or what we've done to the account since termination for any legal holds that might be required. And that's where this disable first comes into play, right? If we disable that account first, we've got that whole picture of what's happening to that account, what that account has done, and we've got all the data that they've had that maybe is important to the company. So the takeaway here is we want to know who can be where and who cannot be where, right? That's the other side of this. Obviously, we need to provision their access for all the roles and duties they have as part of their job. But we also need to keep them out of the areas they should not be in, making sure they've got limited privileges where it makes sense, getting those role-based access, that kind of need-to-know philosophy. All right, so what are some other controls in Group 1 for access control management? Require multi-factor authentication, MFA, for externally exposed application. Now, the standard here calls for any enterprise app. Certainly, we've got to consider cloud apps too. So if you've got an internal application that you've publicly exposed, we should be putting MFA on that whenever technically possible. And that extends to any of the cloud apps that we consume as well. Now, multi-factor typically relies on three things, right? Something you know, something you have, something you are. Technically speaking, if we're going to hit MFA, we've got to hit all three of those. If we're only hitting two, it's only two-factor. Two-factor is better than one-factor. MFA is better than two-factor, right? So anytime you can put MFA where you can provide or require your users to have something you know, something you have, and something you are, that's going to meet the requirement for MFA. Now, there's a lot of debate whether 2FA is MFA or not. I would encourage you at least do 2FA, right? Get that something you have, something you know. If you can get to something you are as well, like a lot of these authenticator apps now require a Face ID or a fingerprint, absolutely add that in. Now, the next control here is MFA for remote access, right? Kind of extending and calling specifically out that, hey, if you're going to provide a VPN, Citrix, I hope you're not using RDP externally, but if you are, make sure you've got MFA on that as well. Again, something you know, something you have, something you are. The next one here is requiring MFA for admin access. So one of the ways that we see folks do this is by establishing a jump box in their environment, right? That jump box is the only place they can get to the AD management, right? We don't have those controls installed anywhere else. Another is SSH, right? How do you do MFA for SSH? The most common way and the most effective way that we see is with a PAM, or privileged access management, right? Something that before you can even open an SSH console, you've authenticated with MFA to this privileged access management or PAM solution, and then you can SSH into that console. Now, certainly we need to extend this MFA for administrative access to any service that we're consuming on the cloud, right? Whether it's software as a solution, infrastructure as a solution, or platform as a solution or service, right? Those should have MFA on those administrative or management consoles. We see this time and time again where folks will stand up Azure or they'll stand up a cloud solution and they just forget to put MFA on it. We'll go through the audit and say, hey, do you have MFA on this platform or infrastructure that you're managing? Oh, no, we forgot to do that. Yes, well, now we're only got one factor, something you know, right? So consider that. Definitely want to make sure you're getting MFA on those admin consoles for any of those platform, infrastructure, software as a service. Get those added as fast as you can. Now let's move on to Group 2 when it comes to access control management. Here we need to maintain an inventory for authentication and authorization systems, right? This kind of piggybacks on what we saw with account management, right? Knowing what we have for authentication and authorization, if we can get that to a single source or centralized, that's best. But if we've got multiple authentication authorization systems, we just need to know what we have. Where are our users authenticating and where are they getting access or authorization? So if you're using single sign-on, hopefully you've only got one, maybe you've got multiple, but certainly you want to capture all your single sign-ons. A lot of organizations, as much as it creates some user friction, will have multiple MFA or multi-factor authentication platform. I've definitely seen environments where we've got one application with Microsoft Authenticator, another with Duo, and maybe even a third one just for fun times with Google Authenticator, right? We need to make sure we capture that and understand the relationship, which authenticators providing that MFA to which service or application. Not all applications can be configured for SSO, right? So in those cases, we're still going to have that native or local login to those applications. That is absolutely something we should be capturing as part of our inventory. Now, the second part of this, right, is that authentication, getting that user logged in, is the roles, right? What are they doing? What do they have permissions to do? That should be part of your inventory capture for these access and authentication authorization, is that, hey, the roles for this application are either coming from my central account management or those roles are managed within the application itself. So understanding how those roles and duties are assigned. Again, this can help you with your onboarding process because if all that is documented, you can say as part of your checklist, okay, go into this application and grant all the permissions there. Now, certainly here too, we want to centralize our access control. So anytime we can, we should be using SSO. If we're using a lot of cloud applications, a cloud access security broker or CASB, that could be a great tool to make sure you reduce that friction for your IT management, kind of get it down to as few panes of glass for your team as possible. Look at group 3, and this is where kind of the role-based access comes in. So we want to define and maintain our role-based access control. What is role-based access? That's effectively need to know, need to use, right? And we want to, as we look at our organization, start defining the access rights based on those duties, right? So if I have a payment processor, that's going to be a role I can define. If I've got a sales executive, maybe that's a role I can define. Maybe I've got developers, that's a role I can define. Maybe I've got shop floor, like my manufacturing floor, that's another role I can define. And as we build these roles, we want to review them annually, at least. Now, this can be tricky, it can be complex, and it can take some time to fully flesh out all the roles and duties that a person has and what the different security groups are going to be. So I absolutely recommend start with those friendly teams as you're building these roles, right? Start with maybe some low-hanging fruit, right? Oh yeah, we feel like we have a good understanding of this role, what this person has to do in this job. I think we can define that. And hey, double bonus, this group, they're really friendly with IT. They know we're trying to improve things and get things better in our environment. They're going to be good partners for us to start our role-based access. Another one you might want to consider is certainly IT, right? Let's start taking away those privileged permissions out of our general computing account, moving those over to an admin account, right? That should be pretty low-hanging fruit because you're in IT already. If something don't work, you can fix it yourself, right? There will always be exceptions to our roles, right? We can never define the perfect roles that cover all the different duties and responsibilities in our companies, in our organizations. So just document those exceptions as you find them, right? If the role that Daniel has got, hey, he needs this access to this other data, just document that exception. When we get into certification audits, like an ISO or SOC 2 report, as long as we have a justifiable reason for an exception to the role, the auditor is going to say, okay, fine. You've documented why the purpose for this exception, all good, moving along to the next topic, right? I would also advise you as you're provisioning accounts, right, granting that access and revoking that access, have a documentation trail to follow that, right? So first, Daniel started on this date. We got the ticket from HR. Here's all the roles we assign. That could be a ticket in your ticketing system, could be an email. If you need to maintain it in a different log, absolutely do that too. But some way to show the reason or the justification why Daniel got an account. You know, was he a new hire? Was he a contingent worker? Was he a contractor? Was it from a vendor? Right? Showing that audit trail of why we're creating accounts in our environment can be very valuable if you're going for an ISO or SOC 2, but also just for your historical purposes. Like, hey, why does Daniel have an account? I don't understand why he's here. Oh, well, because here's the documentation, the evidence trail to show why Daniel got an account. All right, so with access control management, we're focused on knowing who can be where and who cannot be where. All right, so let's move to control 14. Control 14, again, we're continuing on the people part of the CIS top 18. And here we're focused on security awareness and skills training. The goal here really can be summarized to a bit of, hey, we want to inform our users what's expected, how they should be working, and we want to influence their behavior, right? So there's a couple of things that we're going to look at here in Control 14. We're going to look at an overall security and awareness and skills training program, right? We're going to look at how we can train our users on threats to our organization, how we're going to train our users on handling the data, the information that we're entrusted with by our customers and clients. We're going to train folks on how to report when they see something, how to report it and when. And of course, specific training, right? There's going to be roles that are higher risk than others. We got folks in our company who are maybe doing riskier activities. Maybe they got privileged accounts. Maybe they're high profile. So would they need any additional training? So let's take a look at the group 1 elements here. So here, that first step is going to be the program, right? We need to establish and maintain a security awareness program. Now, there's a couple of elements here that the standard calls out, right? We need to educate on what our secure practices are, making sure our users and our employees understand what's expected. At minimum, we need to be doing this training at hire and annually. And we need to have annual updates to our program at minimum, right? So what does that mean, annual updates to our program? Effectively, we just want to make sure the content that we're giving our users at that annual or at hire training matches how we currently work, make sure it's hitting all the elements that we expect our users to follow, right? Now, you could do it annually, but that would not be my recommendation. I prefer a more frequent cadence. So here's my recommendation. This is just Daniel's thoughts. This is not in the CIS standard, so just take this for what it is. But here's my approach that I like, that I've seen success with in the organizations I've worked at. So first, we want a monthly awareness reminder. This is just a quick email. Maybe it's something topical in the news, just something to trigger people's mind of, oh, hey, yeah, I need to be aware of security, be vigilant to what's happening. So just a monthly quick email. Don't make it very long, just maybe a 5-minute read or less, or just a headline in the news, just something to trigger people to say, oh yeah, I need to remember I've got to do all those security things. Now, another element that I like is a monthly phishing test, right? I want to monthly give my users a social engineering test to make sure they're aware, give them that encouragement that, hey, here's all the things I need to check. And of course, if they miss those tests and they click through, then we're going to offer some training. Now, I prefer quarterly short training periods, right? I want to get it in front of their, on top of their mind often, right? So I want to give them about a 15-minute training session quarterly, maybe about 10 minutes or so of content with a short question after that to make sure they've understood what they've watched or what they've read or what they've seen, but something short and sweet, just quarterly, just to keep it fresh in mind, top of mind. Now, of course, on the training on the quarterly, we want to get that goal of 100% completion. It can be tough, especially for large enterprises, but for smaller organizations, it's a little easier to achieve. But we should be driving for that goal of 100% completion, and that should be one of the metrics you track to make sure your program is working. So these 4 points here, this is just security awareness by Daniel. Here's how I would set up my program. It doesn't match CIS completely. Certainly it aligns to it, but it just takes it a step further. Now, when we get back to CIS top 18, one of the controls here in 14 is we want to recognize social engineering, right? We want to train our users on what to recognize when it comes to phishing, pre-texting, and tailgating, right? We're probably all familiar with the social engineering for phishing emails where we get that impersonation or, hey, we've got a new invoice for you. Some others that we see that can be less common in the training is tailgating, right? What does that mean? Hey, for every person that comes in my office, they've got a badge in, close the door, the next person comes in. Yes, it adds some friction to getting into my office, and we all want to be good humans and hold the door open for our colleague or that person bringing a package in. But it's important when we think about physical security, and especially in environments where it has to be controlled, that we prohibit tailgating and train our users that, hey, that's unacceptable for us in our environment. Pretexting, right? Attackers are using text messages to start that conversation to drive towards a phishing attack, right? So we want to train our users on how to identify those social engineering attacks through pretexting as well. Another control here, what we want to train our users on, again, we want to inform and influence their behavior, right? So we want to consider authentication best practices, right? Train our users on good password hygiene, right? What's expected for us? Hopefully, I encourage you, if you're not already, get an approved password management tool, right? If we can train our users, hey, don't worry about remembering a complex unique password, use this tool over here. Inform them what's the approved tool in your environment, right? And even maybe you can extend that guidance to at home, right? Hey, here's a tool that you can use personally, but certainly in our organization, in our enterprise, this is the tool that we use, and this is the approved tool. Going back to MFA, right? If we have multiple tools that we're using in our environment, we want to inform them on what tool to use, when, and where, right? If we've got only one tool, great, easy conversation. If we have multiple MFA tools, maybe a bit more complex. So my encouragement here is we want to train often and praise often, right? As our users are reporting things that we're going to see, or they're recognizing those social engineering, give them that positive feedback, that positive reinforcement. But we also want to get in front of them often, right? Monthly and quarterly reminders of how to keep our organization safe and secure. All right, so the next controls here. We want to train on data handling best practices, right? One of the things that we often see is that we've got documents everywhere on our desk, right? So as I'm done with those documents, put them away. Clear screen, what does that mean? Well, if you're leaving your desk, lock your screen. Pretty simple, right? Or maybe you've got a bunch of confidential or privileged documents open. Somebody's coming in to have a quick chat. Hey, minimize all those before you start having that conversation, just to prevent somebody from seeing something they may not be authorized for. A lot of us have conference rooms or meeting rooms in our offices. I've been in multiple conference rooms where there's been something privileged or confidential left on the whiteboard from the prior group that was in the room. Let's train and inform and influence our users to, hey, when you're leaving the room, clear the whiteboard. It may not seem confidential, but it's just good practice. Another is storing assets, right? CIS Top 18 says storing assets, but what does that really mean? What we're talking about here is, hey, protect the physical assets you've got, right? Obviously, we've got paper. We want to put that in a secure place, but also as we're moving around with our devices, right? Our mobile phones, our tablets, our laptops, making sure we have good physical control of those, making sure we're handling those appropriately. We're not leaving them behind or leaving them somewhere where they could be stolen or lost. Another one we want to train on is unintentional data exposure, right? What do I see commonly with this? We all print stuff, we send it to an MFP or printer that's outside of our office in a common area, and it's got privileged or confidential information on it. Go collect those as soon as you print them, pretty straightforward. When you lose that device, because it's going to happen, it's going to get lost or stolen, we immediately report it to IT and say, hey, I lost this device. That gives IT the best chance, as you know, to send those remote wipe commands. But we need to train our users on how to report it. And again, this is one where if it's an exception, right, we've got this user who just lost one device, certainly praise them and say, hey, appreciate you telling me, thank you. We're going to take care of it, right? We'll get you a new device as fast as we can. Now, if it becomes a pattern with the user, that becomes an HR discussion and maybe a management discussion. But certainly for a one-off lost or stolen device, hey, thank you for reporting. We're going to take care of it. We'll get you a new device as soon as we can. Another one here, And I just saw this last week or the past couple of weeks with a client where we had an attachment go out that was incorrect and it had confidential privileged information. So we want to train our users, hey, before you hit that send button, make sure you've got the correct attachment and the audience that it's going to is authorized and approved to see this data. Now, certainly you can automate some of this with DLP, and I would encourage you to do that, but it comes down to the human first and foremost, right? We want to train them often on, hey, confirm your attachments, make sure that folks are receiving this. One way to make sure the folks that are receiving that attachment, they are authorized to see it, is don't attach it. Send a link or send a folder location, right? That is a great way to make sure you're not sending the incorrect attachment. If you're using some external collaboration tool, hey, put those access roles into that collaboration tool. So that way, if they get the link, they can open it if they're authorized, if they're unauthorized, even if it goes to the wrong group, they can't see it because they're not authorized to access that data. Next, train them reporting, right? We know our users see things in our environment that maybe we're missing because they're frontline, right? They're in front of everything. So we want to train them on when they identify a potential incident, who to report it to and how. This should be both physical and digital, right? If they see something in the environment on their screens, on their device, absolutely want to report it. But this should also extend to physical, right? When we talked about tailgating a moment ago, if they see someone unauthorized in our environment, we absolutely want to train them on who to report that and how, right? Maybe that's reception, maybe it's security. Whoever they need to report it to, we want them to feel empowered and understand that, yes, I should and can report this, and here's who I need to report it to. That could be the first step to a physical breach in my facility, and that's a great thing that our users should be aware of and understand how to report it. And again, another praise point, right? If they see somebody unauthorized, even if we find out they were authorized, hey, thank you for reporting that. We took care of it. Here's what happened. Anytime you can encourage and reinforce those positive behaviors is going to be fantastic. So again, we want to train often and praise often for all of these. So continuing in on group one here for security and awareness training, we want to train our users on updating devices. Now, maybe we handle some of that automation ourselves, right? Maybe we're using some patch management tools, but we still want to train our users, hey, here's how we're going to deliver updates. Now, we need to train them on how those updates are delivered to desktops, laptops, mobiles. Maybe we've got some users who have access to privileged applications, or maybe they got privileged access to servers. So we need to make sure they understand how those updates are going to be delivered and who's going to be doing them. Often we see pop-ups, right, where it says, hey, you need to update your computer. If the users know, hey, that's not what I was expecting, they can go ahead and report it straight away, right? Or if we expect our users to do the updating themselves, we need to train them on how to do it. Now, another one that we need to train our users on is secure transfer, right? This kind of goes back to making sure we've got the right attachment going to the right person, right? We don't have that unintentional disclosure. So we want to give them guidance on what are the approved tools in our environment. And when they're working remotely, whether it be from home or from the airport or coffee shop or wherever, they know how to identify those insecure networks. And they can say, oh, that doesn't look good. Let me use a trusted method to connect back to the company. So again, here, train often, praise often, right? Encourage them to use those tools that we have. You know, anytime they see something that looks suspicious and they're reporting it, we want to praise them and say, hey, good job, thank you, we've taken care of it. All right, now when it gets to group two, here we're going to talk about role-specific training, right? So that's going to be that specialized training, maybe for system admin. And again, here we want to train often and praise often, but here we're focused on those folks who maybe have elevated privileges, right? Those system admins, whether it be my domain or those cloud apps, right? Certainly we want to train those folks. Another group that often needs specialized training is our developers, right? If we've got people writing code in our environment, or for maybe something we're selling to our customers and clients, we need to make sure they're following secure development practices, right? Giving them that training on how to build these applications in a safe and secure means. Some other roles that might need specific training are those high profiles, right? How many of us have a LinkedIn profile, right? Maybe my profile says CEO, CFO, CIO, whatever C level, right? Making sure those users understand how to identify specifically those social engineering attacks. Another group that often could use specific training is those money handlers, right? We've all seen those emails come in of, hey, it's CFO, I'm traveling, or CEO, I'm traveling. I need you, finance person, to wire some money over to this account because we've got an important deal and it's got to happen right away, right? Give those users that specific training on how to identify those flags, what to do when we receive those, right? Let's confirm it with that person, call them or contact them on a trusted means, make sure it's legitimate. Too many times money goes out the door and all the flags are there that the person within some training could have caught it and said, oh yeah, this looks suspicious. Let me just verify this and double check it before the money goes out the door. All right, so train often, praise often. Let's get into control 15, service provider management. So those suppliers and vendors, those other folks that we work with, those other people, right? So traditionally, we're looking at hardware suppliers, software suppliers, our mobile device, mobile carriers, certainly our infrastructure, the folks we're buying switches. But we also need to consider those cloud apps, right? All those blank as a service that we're consuming. Now, some other groups that we need to consider too that sometimes get left out are certainly those kind of non-IT, those business vendors. And one that is common is insurance, right? Is my insurance carrier meeting all my requirements and are they giving us the service we expect? And even those non-IT, right? Even down to the cleaning service and the flower people that come into my office, right? We need to make sure we understand who's in my environment and what they're providing for us. So what are some ways that CIS tells us to work with these? Well, you've heard this before, right? Establish and maintain an inventory. So here, again, all known providers, right? Whether they're doing something IT specific or they're just working with my business, maybe they're a partner or providing some non-IT service. We want to give those vendors a classification or description, understanding their business relationship to us, right? Too many times we see a list of vendors and nobody can explain what this person does. And if we've got that classification or description, it'll help us drive back to how that vendor got into to working with us or our service provider. Enterprise contact, right? Yeah, cool. We've got this vendor. We know what they do, but who the heck do they engage with in our organization? Identifying that person that has that relationship, maybe the contract signer or the system owner, driving back to understanding how this vendor or service provider works in my environment, that enterprise contact is critical. Next, we need to update this inventory annually, right? So at least annually, you want to be doing this. I would probably recommend more annually updating your inventory and maybe doing annual assessments. We'll see in a moment. But here we're focused on a couple things, right? We want to know who you work with and we want to know what they do, right? That's going to be the two critical points out of service provider management. Knowing who we work with and knowing what they do in our environment, that's going to give us a clear picture of our service providers. So when we think about group 2, we need to establish a policy for how we're onboarding new providers, right? What are the things that we require in our environment before we're going to partner, sign a contract, bring in this new supplier or new vendor to work with us? And that policy that we're dictating to our organization, as well as we'll see that's going out to our providers, and we need to update it annually, making sure it matches the current posture of our business, hits all the requirements we've had. Maybe we've started working with new clients and they've got new demands for us and we've got to extend that down to our vendors. So we want to make sure we look at this policy annually. Now, you heard me say classify service providers a moment ago, but what does that mean? Well, CIS provides us this guidance on how to classify our service providers. And I prefer this classification as well because it really drives at how these service providers work with their business. So the first classification or measure or metric that we're going to use is what's the data sensitivity, right? Is this service provider just using public data? That's all they have access to. It's everything on my website, low sensitivity, or are they holding confidential data that's been entrusted to me by my customers or clients, right? Or does this vendor get access to my intellectual property, right? My secret sauce. right? I need to understand what type of data they have access to and what they're using. The other is the criticality to the business. And this here, we're focused on availability and operations, right? So if this vendor has an issue and their product or service that I'm consuming stops working, what's the impact to my operations? Does this bring me to a screeching halt and I can't work and provide my services to my clients and customers? Or is it just one process in one department that, you know what, we can survive for days if this thing is down? Or is it critical to my operational success and they're a key vendor for me? Now, these classifications, again, we want to update annually. Seems like every year we're adding on more services to vendors, right? So we need to make sure we understand what data they're getting access to and what their criticality is to my operations. The next part here, right, as part of that policy, we want to make sure we've got security requirements built in that we're giving to our vendors, right, and our supplier service providers. That could be the minimum requirements, right? Hey, we expect you to treat our data in this way. Here's the minimum effort that we expect, you know, when it comes to encryption, communications, how we're going to work with you. Here's our minimum. A couple of things that we see missing from time to time, or a lack of understanding, maybe is a better way to say it. Who's got responsibility for incident response, right? When I think about my contracts, I want to review them to understand, am I dictating or is my vendor dictating to me who's going to do incident response? Just even understanding will give you clarity on what's going to happen with that vendor, right? Is it my responsibility as the consumer of this product to monitor it for a potential incident, or is the vendor doing it on my behalf? And does their incident response meet my expectations and my requirements? So that gets back to logging, right? As we use the application, who's maintaining the logs for what's going on in that application? Is it myself or is it the vendor? User accounts, right? We talked about that in control 4 and 5. Is the vendor provisioning access and provisioning all the accounts for this application or this service? Or am I expected to do that and maintain that least privilege access, those role-based access? Backups is a huge one, right? A lot of these applications, especially in the cloud, they're doing backups, right? But do I have access to them? Or does their backup schedule meet my expectations and my requirements, right? Just getting that clarity from the vendor to define it, right? Maybe that's just my minimum requirement. Hey, vendor, define what you're doing for backups, incident response, user accounts, and logging, right? That gives me a clear picture of who's doing what. And again, right, we're focused on knowing who we work with and knowing what they do, right? That's that knowing what they do part. If that's our requirement that they've got to define it, maybe I don't even have a requirement of what I'm expecting, right? But I just have the requirement they have to define it, and then I can move from there to whether it meets my expectations or not. All right, so now when we think about group 3, this is where we want to assess our service providers. There's a couple of things we need to review them on, right? Are they meeting the policy that we've defined? Now we can use this, their certifications, their reports, right? If they've got a SOC 2 report and that's a certification, that can absolutely be part of our review. But at minimum, we want to do an annual review on these, and we want to do review their performance at contract review, right? So if I've got a 1-year contract, I'm going to check them then. If it's a 3-year contract, I'm going to review it then. Now, not all vendors need to review on the same cadence. Your riskier critical vendors, maybe I want to do those annually. Somebody like a plant watering service in your office, yeah, we can do them every 3 years. They don't have a lot of access to data. We can do those every 3 years. So that gets back to that criticality, right? Are they getting access to sensitive data, or are they critical to my operations? I want to review those at least annually. The others, we can defer those 2 or 3 years. All right, now we need to monitor our service providers. And again, we want to monitor them based on the policy and the requirements we've given them, making sure they're hitting all of our expectations and requirements. You can absolutely use third-party risk tools for this, right? You know, things, those vendor risk management platforms, right? Any of those will get you part of this monitoring, but it's really up to you, up to us to, hey, are they hitting my requirements that I've given them or not? Are they meeting my expectations? And if they're not, I need to put them on a performance plan to resolve those issues or gaps we've identified. Now, we don't work with all vendors forever and ever, amen, right? We're going to decommission or stop our engagement with that vendor, so we need to have a secure process for basically taking them out of our environment, right? So going back to those vendor accounts, right? We need to make sure we disable those accounts and any integrations, right? Today, nearly every application is integrated to another. Make sure as we're decommissioning those vendors, we disable those integrations as well. And we want to confirm those data deletion and that, as we're dictating to our vendors, hey, we need you to delete all our data, get that confirmation, and make sure that covers the logs and backups that we've established with those vendors. So again, we want to know who you work with here, and we want to know what they do. All right, so that's going to close us out for today. So what did we cover? We took a look at review of CIS, the top 18. We took a look at Control 5 account management. That's know who you have and know who should not be there. We took a look at Control 6, access control management. That's knowing who can be where and who cannot be where. Control 14, security awareness and skills training. We want to train often and praise often, right? Reinforce that positive behavior. And last, we looked at our service provider management and Control 15. So know who you work with and know what they do. So with that wraps us up for today. There's my LinkedIn profile. Love to connect with you there.